Though 1969 was not their last official year musically, creatively and spiritually, it marked the end of the Beatles. This year would see them record 2 albums, their final film would be released, and Paul would sink into a depression with the imminent split of the group. This is the story of the Beatles through 1969.
Trading off the end, actually, off this new album called Abbey Road.
Paul, first of all, congratulations on another super LP from the Beatles.
I personally like it better than the last one that we did, the double album, yeah. So I like the songs a bit better. It's very good.
January begins with the filming for the Get Back project. The details of this are covered in my documentary, The Beatles Get Back Explained. At this time, Apple had become a serious problem. The company that formed was nowhere near profitable. In fact, it was burning through money by the day. It was agreed the company needed a solid manager. Paul was pushing for his father-in-law Lee Eastman, a lawyer based in New York. Eastman, in fairness, had experience with music copyright and was not likely to rip the group off. The other members strongly resisted. They didn't like the idea of Paul having more control over the group, and possibly they feared Paul would get preferential treatment. They did, however, agree to have Lee Eastman and his son John as business advisors. Later, Paul would state, "I put the Eastmans up. I thought they would be fair. For one thing, they are lawyers. They don't take percentages, they take a fee. So they manage you, and at the end of the year, they put in a bill. And if you don't like them, you don't pay the bill. Well, you pay the bill, but you sack them for the next year." Of all the Beatles, John put up the most resistance. He didn't think Eastman was qualified enough, and he also had his sights on Alan Klein. A ruthless businessman, Alan Klein's extremely aggressive negotiation tactics secured millions for his current band, the Rolling Stones. On the 13th of January, John gave an interview with Disc magazine. He laid bare the group's disastrous Apple situation. After the magazine was printed, Paul and George quickly released interviews contradicting John's statements. Paul stated Apple was not on any financial rocks, and George stated, "Apple has plenty of money. We all have. When John said we were losing money, he was talking about giving too much away to charities. We have all been too generous, and that's got to stop." January 27th, John and Yoko meet with Alan Klein in London's Dorchester Hotel. They talk late into the morning. During the meeting, John tells Klein, "Look, the Eastmans are the executive representatives of the Beatles, so we can't talk about that. Would you be willing to represent Yoko and me?" When Klein said he'd sleep on it, John responded, "What's the matter? Don't you want it now?" After the meeting was finished, Klein left, and he later claimed John rang him while he was sleeping, looking to secure a deal for him to manage the Beatles. Lennon would later state, "Alan Klein knew all about us and our music. I knew right away he was the man for us." The next day, Klein meets with the Beatles while they're filming at Savile Row. Paul comes away from the meeting unimpressed. He later stated, "I didn't see the strength in this guy, other than he was a great chatter." February 3rd, another meeting is booked with Alan Klein. This time, John Eastman is in attendance. Before the meeting is scheduled, Mick Jagger contacts John and tells him, "Before you make a commitment to Klein, let me tell you about my experience." Side note, Alan Klein at this point had been managing the Rolling Stones since 1965. To say they'd been unhappy with him would be an understatement. Paul brings Mick to the meeting to testify against Klein's shady business practices. Mick doesn't realise Klein will be in attendance. When Mick walks in and sees Klein, he's immediately intimidated. He sits through the meeting barely saying a word. At one point when asked about Klein, Mick states, "Alan Klein is alright, if you like that sort of thing." No further words are said by Mick. These meetings are later reported by the Enemy magazine and Melody Maker. The group at this time are not happy with the recordings for their next album, Get Back. They decide to record a new album the way they used to. However, they will still release Get Back in the meantime. A release date for the album is scheduled for July. February 20th, Ringo attends the world premiere for Candy. 2 days later, recording for Abbey Road begins. March 2nd, the Beatles are offered $4 million to perform 4 concerts in the States. They refuse the offer. 10 days later, Paul marries Linda Eastman. Afterwards, they fly to New York with Linda's daughter Heather. During this time in New York, Paul writes the song You Never Give Me Your Money about Alan Klein. While Paul is in New York, a meeting is held in London to appoint Alan Klein as their business manager. Paul sends his solicitor to vote against the decision. He's outvoted by the other 3 Beatles. March 21st, Alan Klein is officially appointed as business manager of Apple. Paul refuses to sign any contracts and opposes the decision. With Klein now in charge, Paul is rarely seen at the Apple building. March 20th, John marries Yoko in Gibraltar, and the two use the publicity from their honeymoon to promote world peace. They stage a bed-in at the Amsterdam Hilton that lasts from the 25th to the 21st of March. April 3rd, John and Yoko appear on the Today Show. They explain bagism to the viewers and encourage the host to get into a white bag. Later this month, the two will start a company called Bag Productions Limited. April 6th, the Beatles' Get Back single is premiered on BBC Radio 1. Paul is unhappy with the sound and pulls the other members back into the studio to remix the single. 8 days later, the Beatles' next single, The Ballad of John and Yoko, is recorded by John and Paul. George and Ringo had other arrangements, and John had insisted the song be recorded immediately. A few days later, a photo shoot is held for the single's cover. At this time, the sale for John's Kenwood home is complete and he buys Tittenhurst Park. He chose the property because it resembled Calderstone's house in Liverpool. John had once played in the fields surrounding this mansion as a child. May 13th, the Beatles gather for a photo shoot for their next album, Get Back. They recreate the cover for Please Please Me in the stairwell of EMI. They plan to shoot the picture from the exact same angle, but they can't because a porch has been built blocking the position. The porch is temporarily pulled down and the shot is taken. The album is scheduled for release in July. May 24th, John and Yoko fly to the Bahamas to hold their second bed-in for peace. Unable to stage it in America, John states, "The Bahamas is the nearest we can get to America without a visa." They book a room at the Sheraton Oceanus Hotel. When they arrive, John realises the Bahamas is further from the US than he believed and is put off by the idea of staging a bed-in the 86-degree heat. They decide to fly to Canada. 2 days later, John and Yoko check into the Queen Elizabeth Hotel and their 8-day-long bed-in begins. July 20th, the Beatles are shown a rough copy of the Get Back documentary. They force director Michael Lindsay Hogg to cut an hour's worth of footage for the final product. August 8th, a photo session is held for Abbey Road. This month, the scheduled Get Back album is also due for release. The release is again postponed. August 22nd, the last ever photo shoot of the Beatles takes place at John and Yoko's Tittenhurst home. George is miserable the whole time. The photo shoot begins outside the main house before moving on to the garden. 6 days later, Linda and Paul's first child, Mary, is born. As September begins, the Get Back album is again rescheduled for release in December. September 8th, with Abbey Road finished and soon to be released, the Beatles meet to discuss a follow-up album. John suggests they drop the Lennon and McCartney songwriting and he, Paul and George write 4 songs for the album while Ringo writes 2. During this time, John puts together a new group called the Plastic Ono Band. September 13th, the Plastic Ono Band play the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival Festival. After the festival has finished, John flies back to England and during a meeting at Apple, John announces he's leaving the Beatles. September 26th, Abbey Road is released. October 9th, Yoko is admitted to the hospital on John's 29th birthday. she suffers another miscarriage and John stays with her the entire time. October 11th, the Beatles sign a new contract with EMI negotiated by Alan Klein. At this time, the Get Back documentary is cut down to half its original length and it's retitled to Let It Be. Alan Klein takes credit for the title change. October 20th, the Plastic Ono Band's first single Cold Turkey is released. It doesn't do half as well as expected. That same day, Wedding Album by John and Yoko is also released. 2 days later, Paul, frustrated with Apple and the impending demise of the Beatles, travels to his Scottish home with Linda, her daughter Heather, their new baby Mary and Martha. Paul stays there until mid-December. Some of the photos taken by Linda on this trip will feature on Paul's first solo album, McCartney. While at the farm, Paul sinks into a depression, begins drinking alcohol as soon as he wakes up, and stops shaving. November 24th, still on his Scottish farm, Paul is filmed by journalists inquiring about the Paul is dead rumours. December 12th, the Plastic Ono Band's first album, Live, Peace in Toronto 1969 is released. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for 1970, which will see the official split of the Beatles.